Nestled high in the cradle of jagged mountains, where the air thins and the clouds seem close enough to touch, lay a village so small it could be crossed from end to end in the time it took a kettle to boil. It was a place the outside world seldom reached, for sheer cliffs hemmed it in on one side and a sea of dense, ancient forest pressed against the other. The forest was no ordinary stretch of trees. The villagers called it the realm of the Wolf King. By day it was a cathedral of dark trunks and whispering leaves, but by night, under the silver eye of the moon, it became something else entirely. Pale mists rolled between the pines, the wind carried low, guttural howls that seemed to shiver the very ground, and glints of amber light flashed deep between the trees, as though 100 unseen eyes were watching. From the time a child could walk, they were told the same stories, that the Wolf King's brood roamed those woods, a great family of beasts older than the village itself, guardians of something the mountains had long kept secret. The stories were cautionary but never precise. No one knew exactly why the wolves were there or what they guarded. They only knew the rules. No one crossed into the forest after sundown. No one entered without a charm blessed by the elders. No one, under any circumstances, approached a wolf. It was said that the wolves could smell guilt, and those whose hearts were tainted would not see the sunrise. Every season brought reminders of these warnings. Sometimes hunters would vanish, their tracks leading into the trees but never out. On other occasions, cattle were found torn open in the morning frost, their bodies cold, their blood frozen in black rivulets. When this happened, the villagers would gather in the square, a circle of pale, drawn faces, and prepare the offerings. Clay bowls filled with raw meat, milk, and herbs were left at the forest's edge, along with strips of cloth dipped in salt water. They believed that if they paid their tribute, the wolves would stay in their realm and leave the village untouched. Even the elders, who were supposed to be wise and steady, avoided speaking too loudly about the beasts, as though their voices could carry into the trees and invite attention they did not want. It was in this place of fear and ritual that she lived, the young woman who would one day change the fate of them all. Her name was whispered with both respect and unease. She was a healer, an herbalist who could find remedies where others saw only weeds. She knew every twist of the mountain paths, every hidden spring, every patch of moss that only grew in places where sunlight barely kissed the ground. She could coax fever from a child's body with a poultice of crushed leaves and draw poison from a wound with nothing but boiled roots. But while her hands brought life and her knowledge kept the sick from death, her way of living unsettled her neighbors. She spent more time in the wild than in the village, wandering the hillsides and even, though she would never admit it outright, skirting the borders of the forest itself. She spoke softly to animals when she tended them, not only to goats and chickens but to wild birds, foxes, and once, it was said, to a stag whose antlers shone like polished bronze. Some claimed they had seen her leave food in quiet places in the woods where no human was meant to tread. Children repeated the whispers they overheard from their parents, that she could charm a beast, that she could call a wolf to her side if she wished, that her eyes sometimes held the same glint as the creatures in the forest at night. The rumors grew each time the wolves were sighted, each time their cries echoed over the rooftops. When the howls rose long and mournful under a full moon, some villagers swore the sound seemed to answer something in her, as if it was not warning or threat, but a greeting. Whether it was truth or superstition hardly mattered in a place like this, where stories could twist into fact with nothing more than a cold night and a restless imagination. In the hearts of the people she was no longer just the healer, she was something other, something touched by the wild. And in a village that feared the forest as much as it feared hunger, that was enough to make her both needed and watched, loved and mistrusted, all in the same breath. The winter came early that year, sweeping down from the peaks before the last of the autumn leaves had fallen. First came the wind, a cold so sharp it cut through wool and skin alike, curling into bones and making even the stoutest farmer shiver in his own bed. Then came the snow, heavy and relentless, blanketing the fields until the familiar lines of the land vanished beneath an unbroken sheet of white. Paths to the high pastures became treacherous. Ice clung to branches and froze water in its tracks. The stores of grain and dried meat, carefully hoarded through the summer, began to dwindle far sooner than expected. The cold carried sickness with it too, moving from house to house like a whisper. Children coughed through the night, their thin bodies rattled by fever. Old men lay pale and still, breath wheezing in shallow pools. Even the strong grew weary from the endless shoveling, the endless fight to keep fires alive. Hunger sharpened tempers and tempers sharpened words. More than once, a quarrel broke out in the square over the last bundle of firewood, or a slab of meat hanging in a smokehouse. It was in the dead heart of this bitter season that the slaughter happened. One morning, just as the pale dawn light filtered through the frost-laced windows, a boy burst into the square, his cheeks raw from wind, his voice half-choked with panic. He had been sent to check the far pen where the last of the livestock were kept, goats and 2 stubborn old cows that had survived longer than the others. What he found was not life but carnage. The pen's gate hung open, one hinge splintered as if torn by brute force. The snow inside was churned and blackened, splashed with frozen blood that glittered like dark crystals in the cold. The animals lay scattered, their throats torn in deep, brutal gashes. Some bodies were missing limbs, others lay untouched except for the wound that killed them. Around them, half buried in the snow, were prints, some cloven like hooves, others unmistakably paw-shaped, the size of a man's hand. They led away from the pen and into the forest's edge, where the shadows swallowed all sign of them. By the time the elders arrived, a crowd had already formed, their breath rising in great white plumes. They crouched over the frozen tracks, muttering grimly to one another. No one spoke above a murmur, but every ear caught the same words repeated over and over: wolves. The oldest among them, wrapped in a heavy fur cloak patched with years of wear, straightened from the prince with a face like carved stone. His voice was slow, heavy with the weight of belief. "The cursed wolves," he said. "The Wolf King's brood has grown bold." Those words spread like fire on dry grass. Within an hour they were on every tongue, carried to every doorstep. Wolves had taken livestock before, yes, but never all at once, never from the heart of the village. This was a breach, a sign. Some said it meant the offerings had not been enough. Others whispered that someone had broken the unspoken pact between the forest and the people. The wolves, they murmured, would not attack without reason. Something or someone had called them. And in the curling dark of suspicion, it did not take long for a name to surface. Her rival, a woman only a few years older than the healer, with a clever mouth and a keen sense for the undercurrents of village gossip, was the first to voice it openly. Standing in the square with the others gathered around the ruins of the pen, she let her words drip with calculated doubt. "We all know who spends more time in the woods than is wise," she said, her gaze cutting toward the healer's small house at the edge of the village. "Who feeds strays, who walks where no one else dares. Who else would the wolves spare?" The remark was casual enough to pass for idle talk, but the seed was planted. Others, eager to explain the unexplainable, took it up. "Aye," one muttered, "I've seen her vanish into the pines at dusk." Another added, "And when the howling starts, she's never afraid. Doesn't even flinch." It did not matter that no one had proof, nor that the healer had spent the morning tending to a fevered child far from the slaughter. In the eyes of those who feared the forest's hunger, she fit the shape of the threat they needed. As the days passed and the cold deepened, suspicion hardened into something uglier. Fewer greeted her when she passed in the street. Those who once brought her their sick animals now crossed themselves as she approached. Children were pulled away from her touch. She felt the shift like the tightening of a noose, invisible but they're all the same. The wolves still howled at night, their voices carrying over the rooftops, long and low, like the wind-given breath. But now, when the villagers heard them, they did not simply fear the beasts in the forest. They feared the woman who, perhaps, walked among them. It happened 3 nights after the slaughter, when the moon was a thin white blade hanging above the pines. The snow had fallen heavy that day, muffling the world in deep silence. The only sounds were the creak of ice-laden roofs and the occasional crack of a tree limb bowing under its burden. In the dim orange glow of lamplight, the village seemed almost peaceful, until the first scream tore through it. It was not a scream of fear, but one of frantic desperation. A woman's voice. Doors flew open as people hurried out, scarves hastily wrapped around their faces, boots crunching on the frost. The sound came from the northern edge of the village, where the last houses stood before the tree line swallowed the land. By the time the healer arrived, following the rush of bodies, she saw the woman, Elena, wife of the council's chief, standing in the snow, her hair loose, eyes wild. She was shouting a name into the night. Her son, barely 6 winters old, had not returned from playing in the yard. She had searched every outbuilding, every drift near the fence, but there was no sign of him. The tracks in the snow told a grim story, small footprints trailing toward the edge of the forest, mingled now with the faint impressions of paws. The villagers fanned out immediately, calling the boy's name, their voices swallowed by the black wall of the forest. Torches were lit, the flames bending in the wind, casting strange shadows across the snow. For an hour they searched, the healer among them, her breath clouding the air as she moved between trees, scanning for any sign, a flash of cloth, a print not yet buried by falling flakes. But the forest was vast and the night was deep, and the howls began not long after. Long, mournful cries echoed through the pines, too close for comfort. Some swore they heard a child's cry threaded between them, though whether it was real or imagined, none could say. When they returned empty-handed, the air in the square seemed to crackle with something sharper than cold. The elders gathered quickly, their faces grim. Elena clung to her husband, her eyes red-rimmed and burning. And then, as though a storm cloud shifted and revealed the sun, her gaze fixed on the healer. "You," she said, the word a hiss in the frigid air. "You brought them here." The healer froze, taken aback. "I did no such thing," she began, but Elena's voice rose over hers. "You've been too close to the forest all your life. You feed strays, you walk with no fear where others don't dare. You've been spared when others have been taken. Why?" She pointed a shaking hand, her voice breaking into a sob. "Because you've bargained with them. Because you've given them what they want." The crowd stirred. Murmurs rippled outward. Bargained? Given them what they want? And then someone said it aloud, "Payment." She sent the boy as payment. The healer's stomach turned to ice. "That's a lie," she said, stepping forward, her voice trembling but fierce. "I would never harm a child." But every word she spoke was drowned by the rising swell of voices. The rival who had seeded suspicion earlier slipped through the crowd like a shadow, her lips curved in something too small to be called a smile. "She's always been different," the rival said softly, yet loud enough for those nearest to hear. "Too close to the wolves? Maybe it was time we all saw the truth." The council did not argue. In their eyes, a threat to the chief's family was a threat to the whole village. Whether or not proof existed, fear demanded a sacrifice. The healer tried again to speak, to remind them of every life she had saved, every illness she had cured, but her words seemed to vanish into the cold night air, unheard. By torchlight, the elders conferred in a tight circle. No one else dared speak. When they turned back, the decision was already made. The chief's voice carried the weight of finality. "You will be taken to the forest at nightfall tomorrow. Let the wolves decide your fate." A hush fell over the square as heavy as the snow. Some looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Others stared openly, faces hardened, as if convincing themselves they were doing what must be done. She felt the ground sway beneath her, though she stood still. The firelight painted her in flickers of red and gold, but all she felt was the creeping cold, the deep, bone-deep certainty that nothing she said would change the path they had chosen. Around her, the villagers dispersed, their footsteps crunching in the snow, their torches bobbing away into the dark. Only the rival lingered for a moment, meeting her gaze with something like satisfaction before vanishing into the shadows. The healer turned toward her small home, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a terrible hollow ache. Outside in the distance, a wolf howled, long and low, as though answering a question only she had asked. The night of her exile came cold and still, the kind of cold that crept not only into the skin but into the marrow of the bones, a cold that seemed to silence the very earth. The moon hung full and bright, a silver coin pressed into the velvet of the sky, casting sharp shadows across the snow. Every roof, every branch, every breath gleamed in its pale light. They came for her without ceremony, a small group of men with hard faces and harder eyes, carrying ropes and torches. They did not speak as they bound her wrists, the hemp coarse and biting against her skin. Her breath came in pale bursts, not from panic but from the sharp sting of the air. Still, her heart pounded, not from fear of the forest itself, but from the knowledge that she was being led there by those she had healed, fed, and trusted. The village square, so often a place of trade and laughter, had become a gauntlet. People lined the way, their shadows long and twitching in the torchlight. She heard the first mutters before she stepped fully into the crowd. Then the mutters grew teeth. Witch. Wolf's bride. Murderer. A stone flew from somewhere to her left, striking her shoulder. Not hard enough to injure but hard enough to bruise. Another followed, clattering against her boot. Snow crunched beneath the boots of her escorts as they pushed her forward, the circle of light from their torches bobbing over the frozen ground. More insults rose from the crowd, some spat at her feet, others thrown in her face like the stones. Send her to her master. She'll be well fed tonight. Every step toward the forest felt like a narrowing path, the open space behind her closing in, the black mouth of the trees ahead yawning wider. The shadows of the trunks reached out across the snow like the bars of a cage. The air changed as they drew nearer, it smelled of pine and earth, sharp and wild, cutting through the smoke of the torches. Somewhere deep among the trees an owl called, and then the sound was gone, swallowed by a deeper silence. And then came the first howl. It rose from the darkness ahead, long and low, winding between the trees and spilling out into the open night. It was not the sharp, sudden cry of a kill, but something older, something that spoke of distance and hunger. She felt it vibrate in her chest as though the sound itself had reached into her and pulled at some hidden thread. The men holding her flinched but did not slow. "Hear that?" one muttered to another, his voice too low for the crowd. "They know she's coming." The crowd seemed to take the howl as confirmation of all they believed. Jeers grew louder, more frenzied. A woman's voice cut above the rest. "Leave her there. Let them taste what they've been promised." The trees loomed now, the first branches arching over them like the ribs of some ancient beast. The torchlight wavered, throwing restless shapes across the bark. The forest's edge was marked by a low ridge where the snow fell deeper, swallowing sound and light alike. Without ceremony, the men shoved her forward into that pale, untouched drift. One reached for the ropes at her wrists and cut them roughly, letting the severed cords fall into the snow. Another thrust her a step further toward the shadows. She stumbled but caught herself, turning back to face them. They did not meet her eyes. Instead, they stepped back into the glow of the waiting torches, leaving her in the shadow's edge. Stones fell from a few more hands, though none struck her now. The insults had quieted, replaced by an almost expectant hush. The howls came again, this time from more than one throat, threading together into a chilling chorus. The sound carried through the night air, making even those who hated her shift uneasily. It was the sound they had been waiting for, the herald of her doom. One of the elders lifted his torch, casting a last flicker of light over her face. "The forest will judge you," he said, as if delivering a verdict in some higher court. Then he turned away, leading the others back along the path toward the village. Slowly, the torchlight receded, the circle of orange shrinking until it was nothing but a dim glow far behind. The voices faded. The crunch of boots on snow grew softer and softer, until the only sounds left were the whisper of wind through the pines and the steady beat of her own heart. She was alone. The cold pressed closer now, without the heat of the crowd, without the distraction of their rage. Her breath rose like smoke in the moonlight, curling away into the endless black between the trees. Somewhere in that darkness, eyes might already be watching her. The forest did not move. The shadows did not stir. And yet, she could feel it, the weight of a presence, patient and unseen, waiting to see what she would do next. The cold became a living thing. It gnawed at her fingers, seeped into her boots, and pressed like iron against her lungs with every breath. She walked without knowing how far she had gone from the forest's edge. Each step a struggle, the snow dragging at her legs, the silence heavy enough to feel like weight on her shoulders. Her breath came faster, not from exertion but from the creeping panic that even if she turned back now, she would find no one, nothing, only the long emptiness of winter night. Her legs buckled once. She caught herself on a tree trunk, its bark biting into her palms. Her vision swam, her knees trembling. The forest blurred into shapes, pillars of black and silver, a ceiling of skeletal branches, patches of moonlight scattered on the snow like shards of glass. She took another step, then another, and then the world tilted. She fell to her knees, the impact jarring but oddly distant, muffled by exhaustion. The snow burned where it touched her skin, the cold sinking deeper, deeper still. She thought she heard the wind moving through the pines, but no, the sound was lower, steadier. A rhythm. A breathing that wasn't hers. Her head lifted slowly. They were there. Eyes first, dozens of them, glimmering gold and amber in the darkness, fixed on her from all sides. They hovered between the trunks, motionless, too high or too low to be human. Then shapes began to emerge, as though the forest itself was peeling away from its shadows. The first to step into the light was enormous. A wolf the size of a stag, fur pale silver that caught the moon and scattered it like frost. His shoulders rippled with muscle, his stance steady, regal. His eyes were molten gold, burning but not with rage. Behind him, smaller shapes moved. Lean gray hunters, darker shadows with pointed ears and flicking tails. She had no strength left to run. No strength to plead. She stayed where she was, kneeling in the snow, her breath curling upward in small white ghosts. The silver wolf came forward. The others fanned out, a slow, deliberate circling that was neither rush nor hesitation. Their paws made no sound. She could hear the slow thud of her own heartbeat louder than their movements. The alpha stopped a pace away, his head lowering to sniff the air between them. The smell of him filled her senses, wild, clean and sharp, like snowmelt over stone. His breath came in short huffs that misted in the cold. Then his gaze dropped to her wrists, where the frayed ends of rope still hung. He moved closer, his muzzle brushing the hemp, nostrils flaring. A low sound rumbled in his throat, not a growl but something deeper, more questioning. One of the smaller wolves padded up behind her, its warm breath puffing against her hair. A wet nose nudged her shoulder, and she felt the rasp of a tongue over the raw skin at her wrists. The circling wolves were close enough now that their fur brushed her when they passed. But the circle was not closing in to attack. It was enclosing her, shielding her from something unseen. Her body, tense and braced for the sharp pain of teeth, slowly realized it was not coming. Her eyes met the alpha's. For a heartbeat, there was no cold, no fear, no past or future. Only that connection, as though the forest itself had drawn a line between them. Something passed there, unspoken and wordless. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition. Not prey. Not enemy. Something else. The silver wolf turned, padding silently into the deeper shadows between the trees. He paused, looking back at her. One ear flicked. The rest of the pack moved with him, flowing like water around her, brushing her sides and shoulders as they passed. A smaller wolf lingered beside her, nudging her lightly, then trotting a few paces toward the alpha before glancing back. It was an invitation. She pushed herself unsteadily to her feet, legs trembling with cold and weakness. The snow clung heavy to the hem of her skirt. She took a step toward them, and the wolves shifted in subtle approval, tails flicking, ears angling forward. The alpha began to move again, deeper into the forest. The cold still bit at her skin, but the nearness of the wolves brought a strange, quiet heat. Not enough to warm her body entirely, but enough to keep her moving. They guided her between the trees, the moonlight breaking in silver fragments on their backs. Their paws left no sound, no trace, yet she knew that if she turned she would see many more pairs of eyes watching from the darkness behind them. The forest swallowed the last glimpse of the moonlit clearing. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to change, less bitter, tinged with the scent of pine and something faintly sweet, like damp earth after rain. And still the wolves stayed close. Warmth was the first thing she felt. Not the thin, fleeting kind that came from huddling close to a fire, but a deep, steady heat that wrapped around her like a heavy cloak. It took her a moment to remember where she was, and even then the memory felt strange. The silver alpha, the golden eyes, the silent journey through the trees. Slowly she opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was not wood or sky but stone, arched and irregular, glistening faintly with moisture where thin veins of ice still clung. The floor beneath her was layered in furs, not human-made, but gathered from fallen creatures, clean and soft, smelling faintly of pine and musk. She lay at the heart of a wide cave, its entrance a low, jagged slit that let in slivers of morning light. The light fell in shifting patterns across the ground, where small shapes moved. Pups. Half a dozen of them, their fur a mixture of gray, brown and pale gold, tumbled over one another in play. One darted toward her, tripping over its oversized paws before skidding to a halt just shy of her arm. It sniffed curiously, its tiny nose cold against her skin, before darting back to the others. The sight tugged at something deep in her chest, something that softened the exhaustion and fear. A shadow filled the cave entrance. The silver alpha stepped inside, his fur haloed in the weak light. He carried something in his jaws, a fresh kill, still warm, the scent of blood sharp in the air. Without hesitation he laid it before her. It was not the torn remains of an animal left for scavenging, but a portion set aside, deliberate, as though acknowledging her as part of the pack. She understood the gesture instinctively. She ate, hands steady but mind reeling. The meat was gamey and rich, filling her stomach with heat that spread through her chilled body. The alpha watched until she finished, then turned his head toward the mouth of the cave. Two wolves stationed there shifted slightly, eyes fixed on the forest beyond. They were sentries, guards not only for the pack but now, she realized, for her. The days began to blur after that. She learned their rhythms without being taught. At dawn, the hunters slipped silently into the snow, moving in formation. She followed once she was strong enough, keeping pace as best she could. They taught her wordlessly how to read the forest, where the snow was thin and could hide a pit, where the wind shifted to carry scent, where prey bedded down against the cold. When they returned, the pack rested together in the warmth of the cave, bellies full, breath steady. She tended to those who limped back with wounds, a torn flank from a stag's kick, a bite taken in the struggle over prey. She used what she knew, crushed pine needles to stave off infection, chewed roots to dull pain. The wolves did not resist. They lay still under her hands, their eyes closing in something like trust. At night, the forest whispered to her in dreams. She saw herself running between the trees, her breath clouding the air, the earth pounding beneath her paws, paws not feet. She felt the rhythm of the hunt, the thrum of life in every branch, every drifting snowflake. She drank from streams so cold they seemed to sing, chased deer through fog so thick it wrapped the world in silver. She woke from these visions with her heart racing and a strange ache in her chest, as though part of her longed to stay in that other life. The more she lived among them, the more she understood. The wolves were not the savage, mindless killers the villagers believed. They did not hunt for sport nor kill without need. When food was plentiful, they left the weak and sick alone. When they took life, it was swift and precise. The pups were fed first, the injured cared for. They only turned to livestock or risked approaching the village when hunger clawed so deep it left no choice. In their eyes, survival was not cruelty. It was simply the way of the world. And as she sat in the den, the pups sleeping in a warm knot against her side, she began to see that the cruelty had not been theirs at all. The morning was heavy with mist, the kind that clung to the snow and muffled every sound, making the forest feel even more vast, more secretive than it had the day before. She was awake before dawn, as always, tending to the small fires the alpha allowed her to light near the cave's mouth, warming herself and keeping the pups from shivering. The pack was restless, pacing and sniffing the wind, ears twitching at every distant crack of a branch, every faint rustle in the underbrush. It was one of the smaller wolves, a lithe gray with a keen nose and sharp eyes, that returned first from the outer edges of their territory. The wolf appeared at the cave's entrance, hackles low but tension clear in its stance. It did not approach fully but let out a single, clipped bark that drew her attention. She knew then that it had something urgent to convey. The wolf circled once, then padded closer to her, head low, ears angled, eyes locking onto hers with an insistence that she could not ignore. Its movements were deliberate, insistent, and though it did not speak in words, she understood. The village had moved. They had begun hunting. Not hunting for mere survival, but hunting to strike blame at her companions, the wolves themselves. Her heart thudded painfully. She had seen the fear and suspicion in the villagers' eyes, but she had not imagined the lengths they would go. Several pups had already been killed, their tiny bodies found mutilated at the edges of the snow. Blood had stained the drifts where she had once played with them, and the cries of the pack echoed through the woods in a raw, grief-stricken chorus. The alpha emerged then, his massive frame cutting through the morning mist like a shadow of the mountains themselves. His eyes, molten gold and heavy with thought, fell upon her. He did not speak, yet his presence demanded an answer. He growled low in his throat, a sound that reverberated in her chest, and she understood the question before it left his lips in any human words. Will you let this pass, or will you stand with us? The forest seemed to hold its breath around them. The wind paused. The mist hung frozen midair. The pups nestled at her feet looked up at her with eyes that seemed to plead for guidance, for protection. The wolves around her circled tighter, waiting for her decision, for the signal that would decide whether the forest remained passive or rose as one with her. Her hands clenched at her sides. She felt the cold seep through her gloves, through her skin, but it no longer brought fear. Instead, it sharpened her resolve. She thought of the pups, of the wounded hunters she had tended, of the trust and connection she had earned among these creatures, these misunderstood guardians of the wild. She could not abandon them. Not now, not ever. She lifted her chin and met the alpha's gaze. Her voice was low, almost lost in the wind, but steady. I will stand with you, she said. It was not a declaration of vengeance, though the thought of the villagers' cruelty stirred a bitter fire within her. It was a promise, a bond formed not of anger but of loyalty, protection, and survival. The alpha's growl softened into a low rumble, a sound that seemed to acknowledge her choice. The smaller wolves gathered closer, tails flicking in anticipation, bodies tensing in readiness. They would follow her, but she would lead, not blindly, not recklessly, but with careful strategy, as one who understood the ways of both human and beast. The forest itself seemed to shift around her, as if sensing her determination. Trees creaked gently in the breeze, shadows lengthened and swirled, and even the snow underfoot felt alive with possibility. For the first time she felt that power, the shared strength of a family united, human and wolf intertwined, standing as one against a world that had misunderstood them. Her resolve was clear. She would fight, but not for mere revenge. She would fight to protect her new family, to honor the bond they had forged in the cold, in the dark, in the silence between howls. And with that decision, the air around the den seemed to hum, the wolves' bodies vibrating with anticipation. Together they would rise. The blizzard arrived without warning, rolling over the mountains in sheets of white that swallowed the village whole. Wind tore through the streets like a living thing, howling between the houses, rattling shutters and whipping snow into dizzying spirals. Torches that had once guided villagers through the darkness now bent under the storm, their flames struggling against the gusts. Visibility dropped to mere feet, the familiar paths of the village rendered unrecognizable beneath drifts that grew faster than any shovel could clear. Through the chaos, shapes began to move, at first only shadows in the whitened night, then forms solidifying into massive silhouettes. The wolves. The pack emerged from the forest as if the snow itself had birthed them, their fur dusted with frost, eyes glowing gold and silver against the darkened landscape. They spread in a wide circle, encircling the village, their howls threading together into a single unbroken song of power and warning. It was not mindless terror. Every movement was precise, every step measured. Livestock scattered, frightened by the low, rumbling chorus, while the villagers stumbled from their homes, huddled in doorways, peering into the storm with wide, fearful eyes. At the heart of the circling pack, she appeared. Cloaked in furs scavenged and borrowed from the pack itself, her hair streaming over her shoulders like a dark river, she stepped into the open square. The alpha strode beside her, massive and imposing, muscles rippling under silver fur, his head held high as if he bore the authority of the entire forest. Together they cut a figure both human and other, part of the natural world yet commanding it, a bridge between predator and protector. The villagers froze, recognition dawning slowly and with disbelief. The healer they had cast into the forest, the one they had condemned as a witch, the one they thought dead, stood before them alive, and not as prey. Not as a victim of the wolves' hunger. She was a leader. Every howl from the pack reinforced it, every silent glance of the alpha's eyes binding her authority to the wild power surrounding them. Her voice, though carried only by human sound and not the wind itself, cut through the storm with startling clarity. "Enough," she said. The words seemed to settle over the village like a weight, halting the scurrying of feet and the shouts of panic. She lifted her hands, open, showing she bore no weapons other than the power she had claimed through the bond with her pack. "You have hunted us, hunted my family. You have broken the trust that could have kept us safe. Listen now. Stop the hunts. Respect the forest. Respect the life within it. Or face destruction you cannot imagine." Silence followed her proclamation, broken only by the hiss of wind through eaves and the deep, rumbling growls of wolves stationed at every corner. Her words were not a threat born of cruelty, but of absolute inevitability. Every villager understood, in a way they could not deny, that the wolves were no longer bound to restraint by fear. She had unified them, and they would obey her completely. Some villagers sank to their knees in the snow, heads bowed, hands outstretched as if the storm itself were the one judging them. Others clutched each other in trembling clusters, eyes wide with the realization that the young healer who had walked among them, tended their wounds, and spoken softly to children and animals alike, now commanded a force beyond their comprehension. The council, huddled together near the remains of the town hall, whispered urgently, fear etched into every wrinkle and crease. They exchanged looks that held panic, blame, and desperation in equal measure. They had built walls of authority and tradition, yet here she stood above all, living proof that the old ways had failed to maintain balance, and that new rules would be set, by her and by the forest itself. As the blizzard roared around them, the villagers nodded, some hesitantly, some with full submission. They agreed out loud and voices quivering against the wind, "No more hunts. Respect the forest. Leave the wolves be." The healer lowered her hands slightly, acknowledging their surrender, while the alpha's deep, steady gaze swept across the trembling crowd. In that moment, the village understood, they were no longer masters of the land, nor the creatures who lived upon it. They were its guests, and she was its chosen guide. The howls rose again, a chorus of dominance and unity, echoing across the mountains as if the very peaks themselves had joined in judgment. The storm did not cease, but the village knew for the first time that they were not abandoned. They were seen. They were warned. And they were alive, under the protection of a power they had spent years fearing. Time moved differently after that winter, as if the forest itself had taken control of the rhythm of life. The blizzard that had marked the healer's declaration became a memory whispered in every corner of the village, fading at first into the murmur of ordinary days but never fully disappearing. Seasons shifted, snow melting into spring streams, then summer's green overtaking the bare gray of branches, only for autumn to spill its russet leaves across the fields once more. And throughout it all, the wolves and the village coexisted, cautious and watchful, learning boundaries, negotiating a fragile truce that was enforced as much by respect as by fear. The villagers continued their work, tending crops, repairing barns, and raising livestock, but now always with the forest in mind. They no longer wandered carelessly beyond the tree line, nor did they leave food or animals unattended. The children learned quickly that curiosity had limits. Parents would draw them close when a wolf's distant howl carried over the fields and whisper, "Stay inside, little ones. Respect the forest or the wolf which will come for you." Those words, once meant to scare children into obedience, became a sort of legend in its own right, tethered to the memory of the young healer who had defied death and walked with beasts. She herself never returned fully to human life. Though she maintained her hearth near the village's edge, the forest called to her more insistently than any domestic duty could. Sometimes she was seen at dawn, a shadow among the pines, her fur cloak blending with the silver light of morning frost. Other times at night, her eyes would catch the glint of torchlight from the village, only to disappear again among the trees before anyone could approach. The villagers came to understand that she had become something between worlds, neither fully human, yet no longer entirely of the wild either. The wolves remained her companions, her family, her pack. Pups she had raised grew strong and wise, their eyes bright with the intelligence she had taught them to recognize in the forest. The alpha, silver fur still shining in moonlight, often patrolled with her at the edge of the village, a silent sentinel whose presence reminded humans that the balance must be maintained. Occasionally she led them into hunts or guided them in teaching the pack, her voice and gestures precise, commanding respect and obedience without cruelty. The lessons she had once learned from the forest were now fully hers, flowing naturally, a part of her being. Legends grew from her deeds. Villagers told of the night the healer had returned with the pack, how she had spoken to humans and wolves alike, and how the forest had answered her call. Hunters who once sought to harm the creatures now spoke in hushed tones of respect, leaving offerings at the forest's edge or taking care to repair fences, lest they provoke the wrath of a force they did not fully understand. Children learned the value of kindness, the necessity of listening, and the power of empathy, not merely from stories but from living experience, seeing the pack from afar, hearing their howls carry across the mountains, and sensing the presence of the healer who walked with them. The healer herself spent her days balancing on the threshold between two worlds. She collected herbs and prepared remedies, tending to the villagers' needs when they came willingly, but always returning to the forest before nightfall. She knew every tree, every hidden stream, every secret path that led deep into the wilderness. She communicated with the wolves in ways humans could never truly understand. A glance, a gesture, a nuanced whine or growl, and in return they guided her, guarded her, and shared with her the rhythms of the untamed land. The forest and the village existed in a delicate harmony, maintained by her vigilance and the respect she had earned from both sides. Years passed, and the story of the wolf which became a cornerstone of village culture. Mothers and fathers would use her legend to teach children respect, courage, and wisdom. "Be kind, or the wolf which will come for you," they would say, not merely to frighten, but to instill a sense of accountability. The children listened, wide-eyed, imagining a figure cloaked in furs, moving silently among the trees, her golden eyes glowing in the shadows as she guided her pack with precision and care. The healer's presence became more than just a tale, it was a living reality. Travelers passing near the village would sometimes glimpse her silhouette at the edge of the forest, accompanied by silver-furred wolves that moved like shadows across the snow. They would speak of her in hushed tones, amazed at the union between human and beast, and the quiet power that seemed to radiate from her very being. The villagers took these accounts in stride. To them she was a guardian, a reminder that the wild was not an enemy, but a living force that deserved respect. Over the years she also guided the wolves to better understand humans. Pups were taught to avoid unnecessary confrontation, to recognize when to retreat, and to distinguish between true threats and innocuous travelers. The pack grew in size but never in recklessness. They were disciplined, wise, and deeply loyal, mirroring the qualities she had cultivated within herself. They patrolled the forest in a rhythm that balanced need with caution, hunting only when hunger demanded and avoiding the village except to make their presence known. In this way, predator and human coexisted, each understanding the limits and capabilities of the other. Stories of the healer and her wolves spread beyond the village. Neighboring communities began to speak of the girl who had been cast out, only to return as the mistress of the forest, commanding loyalty and fear alike. The legend became a teaching tool, a warning, and an inspiration. People spoke of the wolves' intelligence, their apparent moral code, and of the healer's unmatched courage. Some skeptics dismissed it as exaggeration, while others swore they had seen her, standing at the forest's edge, eyes reflecting moonlight, silently watching, judging, and protecting. Even the villagers themselves learned humility over time. They understood that nature could not be dominated without consequence and that compassion and respect were the true measures of survival. The healer's example reshaped their culture. Feuds among families softened, resources were shared more equitably, and offerings to the forest became rituals of honor rather than fear. She had changed not just the balance of power, but the moral compass of her people. Through it all, she remained at the forest's edge, neither fully embracing village life nor abandoning it entirely. Her bond with the wolves kept her rooted in the wild, while her humanity allowed her to act as mediator, teacher, and protector. To the villagers she was a living legend, to the wolves she was kin, guide, and packmate. Seasons turned, children grew, and the story persisted, passed down from generation to generation. And so the tale endured, a young healer wronged by fear and jealousy, cast into the wilderness, yet rising to become something greater, a bridge between human and wild, between fear and understanding. Parents continued to whisper to their children, "Be kind or the wolf which will come for you," and in the shadows of the forest, cloaked in furs, the healer watched, always vigilant, always present, forever the guardian of the delicate balance she had fought to restore.